I never thought my life would end like this, in a small clinic room with nothing but a piece of paper and suffocating silence. Dr. Vance didn't even look at me as he slid the report across his desk. His expression cold and clinical. "Barren," he said, as if it were just another medical term and not the complete destruction of everything I'd ever hoped for. My hands trembled as I picked up the paper, and I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces right there in that sterile room. An Omega who couldn't bear pups was worthless. Everyone knew that, but hearing it spoken about you, about your own body, cuts differently than any blade ever could. The walk home felt like a funeral march. Each step dragged me closer to the inevitable confrontation I'd been dreading since leaving the clinic. When I finally reached our apartment, Alpha Callum was already waiting at the door. His arms were crossed, his jaw set in that hard line I'd only seen a handful of times in our 3 years together. But his eyes, those were what broke me. They were cold, distant, looking at me like I was a stranger instead of the Omega he'd held through countless nights. "Jaxon," he said my name like it was a disease he wanted to scrub from his mouth. "You know what I'm going to say." I nodded because yes, I knew. The word rejection had been echoing in my head since I'd left Dr. Vance's office. Still, hearing Callum actually say it felt like being gutted. "I reject you, Jaxon Whitmore. Our bond is over." His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script. No explanation, no comfort, no acknowledgement of the years we'd spent building a life together. Just those cold final words that severed everything between us. I didn't cry. I couldn't if I started. I might never stop, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I walked past him into our apartment, my former apartment, and began packing. Everything I owned fit into one small suitcase, which somehow made the whole thing even more pathetic. 3 years reduced to a bag I could carry with one hand. Callum didn't try to stop me. He didn't apologize or offer any parting words. He just stood there by the door, watching me leave like I was taking out the trash. The night was freezing and dark when I stepped outside. Winter had come early this year, and the bitter wind cut through my jacket like it wasn't even there. But I barely felt it. The numbness inside me was so much deeper than any physical cold could ever reach. I had no destination in mind, no plan, no idea where I was supposed to go now that my entire life had been ripped away. I just walked, one foot in front of the other, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the man who'd just destroyed me. 2 hours later, I found myself on the outskirts of the forest that bordered our territory. My feet were aching, my fingers numb from the cold, but still I kept going. That's when I saw it. An old cabin set back among the trees, half hidden by overgrown brush and years of neglect. The windows were dark, the porch sagging, and it looked like no one had lived there in decades. Perfect. I didn't need much anyway, just 4 walls and a roof to keep out the worst of the weather. The inside was about what I'd expected. Dusty, cold, filled with the smell of abandonment and decay. Cobwebs hung in every corner, and the floorboards creaked ominously under my weight. But it was mine now, or at least it would be. Nobody else wanted this forgotten place. Nobody else would look for me here. I could disappear into this cabin and the forest around it, and the world would forget Jaxon Whitmore ever existed. Maybe that was for the best. I was setting my suitcase down in what I assumed was the bedroom when I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it. A soft whimpering like an animal in distress. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it came again, clearer this time and definitely real. I followed the sound outside, around the back of the cabin where the forest grew thick and dark. That's when I found them. A wooden crate, half buried in snow and fallen leaves, left like garbage someone had dumped and forgotten. Inside were puppies. No, not just puppies. Pups. Wolf pups. 20 of them all huddled together for warmth that wasn't coming. They were so small their eyes still closed, their tiny bodies shaking violently from the cold. Someone had abandoned them here to die. Something inside me broke all over again. But this time it was different. This wasn't the helpless despair I'd felt in Dr. Vance's office or when Callum rejected me. This was rage. Pure burning rage at whoever could do something so cruel, so heartless. These pups were innocent. They deserved better than to freeze to death alone in the woods. I didn't even think about it. I just scooped them up, as many as I could carry, and wrapped them in my jacket. They were so cold their skin felt like ice against mine. I made 3 trips back and forth, carrying all 20 pups into the cabin. Once I had them all inside, I found an old blanket in a closet and laid them out carefully, trying to warm them with my own body heat. They were weak, barely moving, and I had no idea if they would even survive the night. But I had to try. I couldn't save myself from being Barren. I couldn't save my relationship with Callum. But maybe, just maybe, I could save these tiny lives. "I'll protect you," I whispered to them, as I arranged the blanket around their small forms. "No matter what happens, I won't let anyone hurt you again." It was a promise to them and to myself. Maybe Callum thought I was worthless, but these pups needed me. For the first time since leaving that clinic, I felt something other than despair. I felt purpose. As I sat there in that abandoned cabin, surrounded by 20 freezing pups who would die without me, I realized something. My old life was over. Jaxon Whitmore, the rejected Omega, was dead. But maybe, just maybe, I could become something else. Someone who mattered. Someone who could make a difference, even if it was just for these 20 forgotten lives. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in white silence, and for the first time in hours, I didn't feel quite so cold. The next few weeks transformed me in ways I'd never expected. Every morning began before dawn, warming bottles of milk I'd managed to buy from the small-town market miles away, carefully feeding each pup one by one, checking their temperature and making sure they were breathing properly. It was exhausting work that left me perpetually sleep-deprived and running on nothing but determination and cheap coffee. But watching those pups slowly come back to life made every sleepless night worth it. I'd converted the cabin's basement into a secret nursery. It wasn't much, just blankets stacked in corners for warmth, a collection of mismatched bottles I'd scavenged from various stores, and a single lantern that provided the only light in that underground space. But it was safe. The basement had a separate entrance hidden behind overgrown vines, and the thick stone walls kept the temperature more stable than the drafty cabin above. More importantly, no one could see or hear what was down there. The pups were my secret, and I intended to keep it that way. By the third week, real progress became visible. Their eyes started opening, revealing curious gazes that followed my every movement. They began responding to my voice, making tiny sounds that weren't quite howls but weren't just whimpers either. Some of them were stronger than others. There was one particularly feisty pup who always fought his way to the front during feeding time, and another who preferred to sleep curled against my leg whenever I sat down. They were developing personalities, becoming individuals rather than just a mass of fur and need. But with their growth came new complications. They needed more food, more space, more attention. I found myself making longer trips into town, always careful to vary my route and the times I went. I told the few shopkeepers I encountered that I was caring for a sick relative, which explained why I needed so many supplies but kept to myself. They seemed to accept this without question, probably just grateful for the business in their dying mountain town. It was during one of these supply runs that everything changed. I was walking back to my truck, arms loaded with bags, when I passed a community bulletin board near the post office. And there it was, a poster that made my blood run cold. Triplet Alpha Kings searching for lost royal pups in bold letters, with a description that matched my charges almost perfectly. Below that, a reward amount so large it made my head spin, and a warning that anyone withholding information would face serious consequences. Royal pups. The words kept repeating in my head as I drove back to the cabin, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I'd known something was different about them. The unusual markings on their fur that formed patterns too perfect to be random. The way their scent carried something I couldn't quite identify but that felt powerful and ancient. I'd convinced myself it didn't matter, that they were just abandoned pups who needed help. But this changed everything. Back at the cabin, I examined them more carefully. Now that I was looking for it, I could see what I'd been unconsciously ignoring. These weren't ordinary wolf pups. Their bone structure was different, more refined. Their movements had a grace that seemed beyond their age. And that scent, now that I knew what to look for, I could detect the unmistakable mark of royalty, something that went beyond mere alpha bloodlines. Fear gripped me then, real and visceral. If these were royal pups, then powerful people were looking for them. People who would want to know why a rejected Barren Omega had been hiding them instead of immediately reporting their location. Would they believe I'd just found them? Or would they assume I'd stolen them, planned to ransom them, or worse? My mind spun through increasingly terrible scenarios, each one ending with me in chains or dead. I looked down at the pups, who were completely oblivious to my crisis. One of them, the feisty one, crawled over to me and grabbed my finger with his tiny mouth. Not biting, just holding on. Something in that simple gesture steadied me. These pups had been left to die, Someone had abandoned them in a crate in the middle of winter, left them to freeze or starve or be eaten by predators. Royal or not, they'd been treated like trash. "I can't give you back," I whispered to them, knowing it was probably the worst decision I'd ever make. "Not yet, not until I know you'll be safe." It was irrational, dangerous, possibly suicidal, but I'd already lost everything else. What was one more bad choice in a life full of them? At least this time I'd be losing everything for something that mattered. I spent the next 2 days making the basement more secure. I installed a better hidden door, one that looked like part of the stone wall unless you knew exactly where to look. I scattered my supplies across multiple hiding spots instead of keeping everything together. I practiced my story. I lived alone, I kept to myself. I hadn't seen anything unusual. The lies came surprisingly easily. At night, I'd lie on the basement floor with the pups piled around me, their warm bodies pressed against mine as they slept. Their trust was absolute and terrifying. They had no idea I was keeping them from their real family, that every day I didn't report them was another day I was breaking what was probably a dozen different laws. They just knew I fed them, kept them warm, and made them feel safe. In their simple world, that made me everything. Callum had called me barren, worthless, not worth keeping. Dr. Vance had confirmed it with cold medical facts. But here, in this hidden basement with 20 royal pups who depended on me for survival, I felt anything but worthless. I felt needed, essential, like my existence actually mattered to someone, even if that someone was too young to understand what mattering meant. The knock on my door the next morning shattered that fragile peace like a hammer through glass. It wasn't a polite knock or even a friendly one. It was commanding, authoritative, the kind of knock that said, "Open this door immediately or we'll open it for you." My whole body went rigid with fear. I knew that knock. Every Omega knew that knock. It was an alpha knock, and not just any alpha. This was the knock of someone with power, authority, and the absolute certainty that they would get what they wanted. The pups were still in the basement. Thank the moon. I'd just finished feeding them and hadn't brought them up yet. I sealed the hidden door as quietly as I could, then forced myself to walk upstairs on shaking legs. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was it. Whatever happened next would determine everything, whether I kept my freedom, whether the pups stayed safe, whether my choice to hide them had been brave or catastrophically stupid. I reached for the door handle, took one last deep breath, and opened it to face whatever fate had brought to my doorstep. 3 men stood on my porch, and the sheer presence they radiated nearly knocked me backward. These weren't just alphas, they were something far more powerful, something that made my Omega instincts scream at me to submit, to bare my throat, to show respect to creatures so far above my station that we might as well be different species. I forced myself to stay upright, to meet their eyes even though everything in my biology was telling me to look away. The first one was massive, easily 6'4" with shoulders broad enough to block out the weak morning sunlight behind him. His dark hair was slightly too long, falling into storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through me and into every secret I was desperately trying to hide. Everything about him screamed command, from his rigid posture to the way he held himself like someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. This had to be Damon, the eldest of the Triplet Kings. The second alpha was slightly shorter but no less intimidating. Where Damon was all hard edges and military precision, this one had a more relaxed stance that somehow made him more dangerous rather than less. His sharp jawline could have cut glass, and his intense blue eyes tracked every tiny movement I made with predatory focus. Nolan, I guessed, the middle triplet known for being deceptively easygoing right up until he wasn't. The third alpha was quieter than his brothers, standing slightly behind them in a way that might have seemed submissive if not for the absolute authority radiating from him. His hazel eyes and softer features made him look more approachable than the other two, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made me more nervous than either of his brothers. Reese, the youngest, supposedly the most dangerous, despite appearing the gentlest. Or maybe because of it. "We're searching for something," Damon said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through my chest. "Royal pups, 20 of them stolen from the palace nursery 3 weeks ago. Have you noticed anything unusual in this area?" His eyes never left mine, searching for any hint of deception. I was suddenly very grateful for all those hours I'd spent practicing my lies. I shook my head, forcing my expression into something I hoped looked confused and concerned rather than terrified. "No, I haven't seen anything like that. I live alone out here. Don't get many visitors." It wasn't technically a lie. I really hadn't seen the pups being stolen since I'd found them already abandoned. I was just leaving out the part where I currently had all 20 hidden in my basement. Nolan's gaze swept over the cabin with the thoroughness of someone trained to spot inconsistencies. "Your scent is interesting," he said, and I felt my blood turn to ice. "You're an Omega, aren't you, unbonded?" There was no judgment in his voice, just curiosity, but the question felt like a trap anyway. Omegas didn't usually live alone in isolated cabins. We were supposed to be with packs, with alphas, contributing to the continuation of our species. A lone Omega was unusual enough to warrant suspicion. "Yes," I admitted, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. "I don't have a bond anymore. I prefer the solitude. Let them make of that what they would." Most alphas didn't push when Omegas mentioned broken bonds. It was considered poor manners to dig into someone else's rejection. Reese hadn't spoken yet, but his eyes were doing all the talking, his mouth wasn't. He watched me with an intensity that made my skin prickle, like he was cataloging every breath I took, every micro-expression that crossed my face, building a profile of who I was and what I might be hiding. It was deeply unsettling, and I had to resist the urge to fidget under that unwavering stare. "These pups are extremely valuable," Damon continued, apparently satisfied with my initial responses. "They're not just royal bloodline, they're the future of the entire Northern Territories. If they're not found soon," he trailed off. But the implication was clear. Without those pups, political stability would crumble. Wars might start, thousands could die, and I was standing here lying to their faces while the future of the kingdom slept in my basement wrapped in old blankets. "If I see anything suspicious, I'll contact the authorities immediately," I promised, and hated how easily the lie rolled off my tongue. When had I become someone who could look royalty in the eye and deceive them without hesitation? A month ago, I would have been horrified at the thought, but a month ago, I hadn't been responsible for 20 tiny lives that someone had thrown away like garbage. Damon nodded, seeming to accept this but made no move to leave. Instead, he pulled out a card and handed it to me. "This has our direct contact information. Day or night, if you remember anything or notice something unusual, you call that number. Understood?" It wasn't really a question. I took the card, noting how thick and expensive the paper felt. Even their business cards screamed power and wealth. Nolan was still studying the cabin, and I could see his mind working behind those blue eyes. "Seems like a lot of space for one person," he observed casually. "You planning to stay here long term?" Another trap question. If I said yes, why would a lone Omega choose permanent isolation? If I said no, why was I here at all? "I'm taking things one day at a time," I answered carefully. After my bond broke, I needed space to figure out what comes next. This seemed like a good place to do that. Vague enough to be believable, specific enough to sound genuine. I was getting disturbingly good at this. Reese finally spoke, and his voice was softer than I'd expected, almost gentle. "That must have been painful, losing your bond." There was real sympathy in his tone, but also something else, a probing quality, like he was testing to see how I'd react to unexpected kindness. I wondered if this was some kind of interrogation technique they taught at the Royal Academy. It was, I admitted, because lying about that seemed pointless. But I'm managing. I was managing by hiding royal pups and committing what was probably treason, but he didn't need to know that part. The three alphas exchanged looks, some kind of silent communication passing between them that I couldn't interpret. Then Damon stepped back from the door. "We'll be in the area for a while, conducting searches. You might see us around. Don't be alarmed." It sounded like a courtesy, but I knew it was really a warning. They'd be watching. If I gave them any reason to be suspicious, they'd be back. As they turned to leave, Reese paused and looked back at me one more time. That hazel gaze pinned me in place, searching for something I desperately hoped he wouldn't find. "Take care of yourself out here," he said quietly. "It can be dangerous being alone in these woods." Then he was gone, following his brothers down the porch steps and into the forest. I stood frozen in the doorway until they were completely out of sight, then carefully closed and locked the door. My legs were shaking so badly I had to lean against the wall for support. That had been too close, way too close. If they'd asked to search the cabin, if they'd heard even the slightest sound from downstairs, if my scent had been just a bit different from anxiety, a soft whimpering from the basement broke through my spiraling thoughts. The pups were awake and probably hungry again. I made my way downstairs on unsteady legs and opened the hidden door. 20 pairs of eyes, some still cloudy with youth, others clearing to reveal striking colors, looked up at me with complete trust. They had no idea how close they'd just come to being discovered. "We have to be more careful," I whispered to them as I started preparing bottles. "Those were the Kings, the Triplet Alpha Kings. They're looking for you and they're not going to stop." One of the pups, my favorite feisty one, crawled into my lap and nuzzled against my chest. The simple gesture of affection made my eyes burn with unshed tears. I'd made my choice when I decided to hide them. Now I had to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. The Kings would be back. Damon had made that clear. And next time I might not be lucky enough to fool them. But for now, for this moment, the pups were safe. Fed, warm, and protected. Everything else would have to wait. As I fed them one by one, I tried not to think about Reese's final words. Dangerous, being alone in these woods. Had that been genuine concern, or had it been a threat? With royalty, it was impossible to tell. All I knew was that my simple plan of hiding until the pups were old enough to survive on their own had just become infinitely more complicated. The game had changed. The Kings knew a lone Omega lived in these woods. They'd be watching, waiting, looking for any slip that might lead them to their missing heirs. And I had to keep 20 increasingly active, increasingly vocal pups completely hidden from the 3 most powerful alphas in the kingdom. What could possibly go wrong? The visits became a pattern over the following week. Sometimes Damon would show up alone, his gray eyes scanning the tree line around my cabin as if the missing pups might suddenly materialize from the shadows. Other times Nolan would arrive with a casual smile that never quite reached his calculating blue gaze, asking seemingly innocent questions about the local wildlife and whether I'd heard any unusual sounds at night. And occasionally, all 3 would come together, their combined presence so overwhelming that I had to fight my Omega instincts just to remain standing upright. Each encounter was a test of my acting ability. I'd perfected a repertoire of confused expressions, helpful suggestions about places they might search, and sympathetic noises about how terrible it must be to lose something so precious. The lies came easier each time, which should have worried me more than it did. But what truly unsettled me was how their scent affected me more with each visit. Pine and smoke and that indefinable dark undertone that spoke of power and danger. It clung to my cabin long after they left, making the pups restless and making my own instincts go haywire. Reese was the worst. He rarely spoke during these visits, content to let his brothers do the talking while he observed everything with those penetrating hazel eyes. I could feel his gaze on me constantly, cataloging every nervous gesture, every too quick response, every time I glanced toward the basement door. He knew something was off. I was certain of it. He just hadn't figured out exactly what yet. The storm hit on a Tuesday night without warning. One moment I was in the basement feeding the pups their evening meal, and the next the whole cabin was shaking from thunder that sounded like the sky was being torn apart. Lightning flashed so bright it leaked through the cracks in the basement door, and the pups started whimpering in fear despite my attempts to calm them. I'd never heard weather this violent before, not even during the worst winter storms. Then came the crash. Something huge and heavy slammed into the side of the cabin, a tree branch maybe, or debris picked up by the wind. The impact was strong enough to rattle the walls and send dust raining down from the ceiling. The electricity cut out immediately, plunging everything into darkness except for the occasional lightning flash. The pups' whimpering turned to panicked yelps. I had to check the damage. Leaving the pups was risky, but if the cabin was compromised, we were all in danger anyway. I fumbled my way up the stairs, using my phone's flashlight to navigate. When I reached the main floor, I saw the front door hanging open, swinging wildly in the wind. The latch must have broken from the impact. Rain was already flooding in, soaking the old wooden floor. That's when I saw them through the doorway. 3 figures running through the storm, heading straight for my cabin. My heart stopped. Even drenched and half visible through the sheets of rain, I recognized their silhouettes. The Kings. Of course they'd be out in this weather. They were probably checking on all the isolated cabins in the area, making sure no one needed help, or looking for any sign of their missing pups. There was no time to close the door and pretend I wasn't home. They'd already seen the light from my phone. I couldn't refuse them shelter in weather like this without seeming suspicious. I was trapped by my own cover story and basic pack hospitality rules. Nolan reached the porch first, water streaming from his dark hair. "Sorry to intrude," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. The storm came up faster than predicted. "Mind if we waited out here?" It wasn't really a question. They were already crossing the threshold, bringing the scent of rain and alpha power with them. Of course I managed to say, stepping back to give them room. It's dangerous to be out in this. My voice sounded steady, which was a minor miracle considering my heart was trying to pound its way out of my chest. The pups were one floor below us. 20 royal pups that these alphas had been searching for. One wrong sound and everything would unravel. Damon's eyes swept the cabin's interior, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of every detail he might notice. The extra baby bottles drying by the sink that I'd forgotten to hide, the smell of formula that might still be lingering, the way I was standing positioned between them and the basement door as if my body could somehow shield what was below. "You live here completely alone?" Damon asked, shaking water from his jacket. "This is extremely isolated. Most Omegas prefer pack settings." There was no accusation in his voice, just curiosity, but every question felt like walking through a minefield. I forced a smile that I hoped looked natural. "I appreciate the solitude. It's peaceful, helps me think." The irony of calling my current situation peaceful would have been funny if I wasn't so terrified. Between the storm raging outside and the royal alphas standing in my living room, peace was the last thing I was experiencing. Reese hadn't said anything yet. He was doing that thing he always did, watching, analyzing, processing information I didn't even know I was giving him. His gaze moved methodically around the cabin, pausing on details I couldn't predict. The stack of blankets in the corner, the medical supplies I'd bought for the pups, the way the basement door didn't quite sit flush with the floor. Thunder cracked so loud it felt like the world was splitting open, and in that moment of deafening sound I heard it, a tiny whimper from below, barely audible over the storm, but there, clear and unmistakable, one of the pups scared by the thunder, crying out. Time seemed to freeze. Damon's head turned toward the sound. Nolan's relaxed posture shifted into alertness, and Reese was already moving toward the basement door before I could even process what was happening. What was that? Damon's voice cut through the storm's noise like a knife. My mind raced through possible explanations. "Probably just the wind," I said quickly. "Old cabin, lots of drafts. The storm is making everything creak and groan." Even to my own ears, it sounded weak, desperate. But Reese was already at the basement door, his hand on the handle. "This doesn't sound like wind." His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd been aggressive. He pulled the door open. I should have stopped him, should have blocked his path, come up with a better lie, anything. But Nolan's hand landed on my shoulder. Not threatening, almost sympathetic, but firm enough to keep me in place. "Jaxon," he said my name softly, and hearing it from his lips sent a strange shiver through me. "Tell us the truth, please. Whatever it is, we can work it out." I stood frozen as Reese descended the stairs, each footstep echoing in my ears louder than the thunder. This was it. The moment everything I'd built came crashing down. All the careful hiding, the elaborate lies, the weeks of constant vigilance, all of it ending because of one storm and one frightened pup who couldn't stay quiet. Silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then Reese's voice drifted up from the basement, soft and filled with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "Damon, Nolan, you need to see this, right now." I closed my eyes, unable to watch as the other two alphas moved past me and down the stairs. This was the end. They'd take the pups, arrest me for hiding royal property, maybe execute me for treason. At best, I'd spend the rest of my life in a dungeon somewhere. At worst, I didn't want to think about worst. When they came back up, Damon was cradling one of the pups in his massive hands. The tiny creature looked impossibly small against his chest, and I could see tears tracking down his face. Actual tears, from the fearsome Alpha King. "These are our pups," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. "You've had them this whole time, you saved them." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "You did all of this?" Nolan and Reese stood behind him, each holding pups of their own, their faces showing variations of shock and something that might have been awe. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stand there as my entire world shifted beneath my feet, waiting to see whether I'd just destroyed my life or somehow impossibly changed it forever. Words failed me completely, as I stood there watching three of the most powerful alphas in existence hold their recovered pups with expressions of wonder and relief. My throat felt tight, my mind blank of any explanation that could possibly make sense of what I'd done. How could I explain weeks of deception to the very people I'd been deceiving? Without waiting for my response, all three of them headed down to the basement. I followed on shaking legs, feeling like a prisoner being led to judgment. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, they stopped dead, taking in the full scope of my secret nursery. 20 pups in various states of alertness, some sleeping peacefully while others crawled around exploring their limited space. Bottles organized by feeding schedule, blankets arranged for maximum warmth, a heating lamp I'd rigged from spare parts, medical supplies carefully stored in labeled containers. It was evidence, undeniable proof that I'd been hiding their children for weeks. But it was also proof of something else, that I'd been caring for them, keeping them alive, treating them like they were precious rather than disposable. I watched the three kings process this contradiction, their faces cycling through emotions too complex for me to fully read. Damon set the pup he'd been holding down gently among its siblings, then turned to face me with an intensity that made me want to shrink back. Explain, now, everything from the beginning. His voice carried the full weight of his authority, and my Omega instincts screamed at me to submit, to tell him whatever he wanted to hear. But I forced myself to stand straight, to meet his eyes, to give him the truth he was demanding. So I told them about finding the pups that first night in a crate behind the cabin, already half frozen and barely clinging to life, about spending hours warming them, feeding them, bringing them back from the edge of death, about seeing the posters and realizing these weren't just abandoned pups but something far more valuable and dangerous, about the impossible choice between turning them in to unknown authorities who might not care for them properly, or keeping them hidden until I knew they'd be safe. I didn't know they were yours specifically, I said, hating how defensive I sounded. The posters just said royal pups. There was no information about who had taken them or why they'd been abandoned. For all I knew, turning them in might have sent them right back to whoever tried to kill them in the first place. Nolan's expression shifted as he processed this. You thought someone in the palace might have been responsible. It wasn't a question, and the grim set of his jaw suggested this possibility had occurred to them as well. That's why you didn't contact us directly. You were protecting them from a threat you couldn't identify. I'm a rejected Omega with no status and no connections, I said quietly. Who would have believed me? Who would have listened? The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. Callum threw me away because I'm barren. The medical system labeled me defective. I had no reason to think anyone in power would take me seriously. If I came forward with claims about finding royal pups, the name slipped out before I could stop it, and I saw all three alphas' attention sharpen. Callum, Damon repeated slowly. Your former alpha rejected you because of a barren diagnosis. There was something dangerous in his tone now. Something that made me nervous for entirely different reasons. I nodded, not trusting my voice. That word still hurt, still cut deep, even though I'd been trying to convince myself it didn't matter anymore. Barren. Useless. Broken. All the things Callum's rejection had confirmed about my worth as an Omega. But then Reese did something completely unexpected. He knelt down among the pups, letting them crawl over him, and looked up at me with those intense hazel eyes. You've been caring for 20 pups alone for weeks, he said softly, feeding them every few hours, keeping them warm, clean, healthy, teaching them to feel safe despite being abandoned. That's not something a barren Omega does, Jaxon. That's what a parent does. The words hit me like a physical blow. My vision blurred with sudden tears that I tried desperately to blink back. No one had ever said anything like that to me. Not once since Dr. Vance had given me that diagnosis had anyone suggested I might still have value, might still be capable of nurturing and protecting. These pups wouldn't have survived without you, Nolan added, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. We've been searching everywhere, following every lead, checking every possible location. We never thought to look in an abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere. If you hadn't found them that night, if you hadn't made the choice to save them despite the risk to yourself. He trailed off, but the implication was clear. The future heirs of the Northern Territories would have frozen to death, and no one would have ever known what happened to them. Damon carefully lifted another pup, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what healthy development should look like. They're in good condition. Better than good, actually. No signs of neglect or malnutrition. Their coats are clean, their weights are appropriate for their age. You've been doing everything right. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. How did you even know what to do? Most Omegas don't have experience with newborn pups. I researched, I admitted, spent every spare moment reading everything I could find about pup care, made lists, followed schedules, monitored their development. I was terrified I'd mess something up and hurt them. The confession felt vulnerable, exposing just how desperately I'd wanted to succeed at this one thing after failing at everything else. The three alphas exchanged looks, some kind of silent communication passing between them that I couldn't interpret. Then Damon set the pup back down and approached me, each step deliberate and measured. I fought the urge to retreat, to put distance between myself and his overwhelming presence. "We want to ask you something," he said, and something in his tone made my heart skip. "Come with us, back to pack territory. The pups need you, they've bonded with you, learned to trust you. Separating them from you now would be cruel." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "And we don't want to lose you either." My brain short-circuited trying to process what he was suggesting. "You want me to what? Be their nanny? I don't understand." "Not their nanny," Nolan said, stepping closer. "Our mate. The three of us have been searching for our fated mate for years. Our wolves recognized you the first time we met. We just didn't understand why until now." His hand reached out, fingers brushing my arm in a touch that sent electricity racing through my nervous system. "You saved our children, Jaxon. You put their lives above your own safety. You're already everything we've been looking for." I jerked back, shaking my head frantically. "That's insane. I'm Barren, your kings who need heirs and political alliances. This doesn't make any sense." Panic was rising in my chest, making it hard to breathe. This had to be some kind of test or trick. People like me didn't end up mated to royalty. That wasn't how the world worked. Rhys moved closer, his approach slower and more careful than his brother's. "You're already parenting 20 royal pups. Whether or not you can biologically bear children is irrelevant when you've proven you can love and protect the ones who need you." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Our wolves chose you. Our pups chose you. The only question is whether you'll choose us back." "I can't," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't understand. I'm damaged, broken. Everyone I've ever trusted has confirmed it. Why would you want someone like me?" The words tore out of me, raw and painful, exposing wounds I'd tried so hard to keep hidden. "Because," Damon said firmly, "you're the only person in this entire kingdom who put our children's welfare above power, politics, and personal gain. That makes you more valuable than any perfect Omega could ever be." He held out his hand. "Trust us. Please, let us prove that you're worth everything we could ever offer." I stared at his outstretched hand, my entire world balancing on the edge of a decision I'd never imagined having to make. Behind them, the pups I'd saved and raised made soft sounds in their sleep, completely unaware that their future and mine was being decided in this moment. Trust didn't come easily to someone who'd been rejected and discarded. But as I looked at the three alphas watching me with expressions of hope and determination, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to take a leap of faith. Dawn broke cold and clear as we prepared to leave the cabin that had been my sanctuary and prison for the past weeks. The storm had passed, leaving everything covered in a fresh layer of frost that sparkled in the early light. I moved through the familiar space, gathering the few possessions I'd accumulated, my hands trembling slightly with nerves I couldn't quite suppress. The three kings worked efficiently around me, packing up the pups and all their supplies with a coordination that spoke of years working together. The drive to pack territory took 3 hours, and I spent most of it in the back of an SUV, surrounded by carefully secured carriers holding the pups. They'd rigged a heating system to keep the babies warm during transport, showing a level of care and preparation that eased some of my anxiety. Damon drove while Nolan navigated, and Rhys sat in back with me, his presence both comforting and unnerving in equal measure. "They're going to stare," Rhys said quietly about halfway through the journey, his eyes on the passing landscape. "The pack, when they see a strange Omega arriving with us and the missing pups, there will be questions, speculation, probably some hostility." He turned to look at me. "Are you prepared for that?" Honestly, I wasn't sure. The idea of facing hundreds of strange wolves, all of them curious about the nobody Omega who'd somehow ended up connected to their kings, made my stomach churn with anxiety. "What will you tell them?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "The truth," Damon said from the front seat. "That you saved our children when we couldn't. That you're under our protection now. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with us directly." The steel in his voice suggested that would be an extremely unwise decision. As we crossed into official pack territory, I noticed the landscape changing. The wild forest gave way to organized farmland, then small clusters of houses, then larger buildings that suggested we were approaching something significant. My heart rate picked up with each mile, anxiety and anticipation mixing into a cocktail that made me feel slightly nauseous. Then I saw it, the pack center, a massive gathering space surrounded by impressive buildings that spoke of wealth and power. And filling that space were wolves. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all gathered as if they'd been waiting for our arrival. The crowd parted as we drove through, faces turning to track our progress with expressions ranging from curious to shocked to openly suspicious. We pulled up to the central platform where official announcements were traditionally made. I could see the crowd pressing closer, trying to get a better look at what was happening. Nolan opened my door and offered his hand to help me out, a gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed by the watching pack. I stepped out on shaking legs, immediately overwhelmed by the sheer number of eyes locked on me. Damon and Reese were already lifting carriers from the vehicle, and as they opened them to reveal the pups inside, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I watched as recognition dawned on face after face. These were the missing royal heirs everyone had been searching for, the lost pups who'd been mourned as likely dead, and here they were, alive and healthy and being presented by their fathers. The three kings positioned me between them on the platform, each holding multiple pups in their arms. I felt exposed standing there, aware of every whisper, every pointing finger, every judgmental stare from wolves who outranked me in every possible way. My Omega instincts screamed at me to make myself smaller, to hide, to escape this overwhelming attention. Then Damon's voice rang out across the gathering, amplified by the natural acoustics of the space and his own alpha authority. Members of the Northern Pack, our children have been found and returned to us, alive and thriving. This Omega, Jaxon Whitmore, discovered them abandoned and near death. Rather than seeking reward or recognition, he spent weeks caring for them in secret, protecting them from unknown threats, ensuring their survival through his own sacrifice and dedication. The murmuring in the crowd shifted, curiosity replacing some of the hostility. I kept my eyes down, not wanting to see their reactions, not wanting to know whether they believed or doubted the story being told. Nolan stepped forward, raising one of the pups high enough for the whole crowd to see. From this moment forward, Jaxon is not merely a pack member. He is recognized as our mate and the parent these children needed when we could not be there for them. His actions have secured the future of our bloodline and the stability of our territory. My head snapped up in shock. We'd discussed me coming to pack territory, maybe helping care for the pups. But the public declaration of mate status was something else entirely. This wasn't just acceptance, this was elevation to a position of power and responsibility I'd never asked for and didn't feel qualified to hold. But Reese was already speaking, his quieter voice somehow carrying just as much weight as his brother's. Anyone who claims this Omega is Barren speaks from ignorance. He has demonstrated the greatest strength any parent can possess, unconditional love given freely without expectation of return. He sacrificed his safety, his resources, and his peace of mind to protect children he had no obligation to care for. That is not weakness. That is not deficiency. That is the truest form of strength. Then something happened that I never could have predicted. One by one, starting from the front rows and spreading backward through the massive crowd, pack members began to bow, not a casual nod of acknowledgement, but a full formal bow that signified deep respect and recognition of superior status. Hundreds of wolves, many of them higher ranked than I'd ever dreamed of being, lowering their heads to me. Tears began streaming down my face before I could stop them. All my life I'd been told I was worthless, broken, not good enough. Callum had thrown me away. Dr. Vance had labeled me defective. I'd internalized all of it, believed that my inability to bear pups made me fundamentally lesser than other Omegas. And now, standing on this platform in front of thousands of witnesses, I was being honored for the very thing I'd thought made me worthless, my capacity to nurture and protect. Damon's arm wrapped around my shoulders, pulling me against his solid warmth. "You gave us back our world," he murmured in my ear, his voice thick with emotion. "Now we're giving you a place in it. No more hiding, no more shame. You're ours now, and we protect what's ours." Nolan moved to my other side, his hand finding mine and squeezing gently. The contact sent warmth flooding through me, that strange electric feeling I'd been trying to ignore since the first time we met. "Welcome home, Jaxon. This is where you were always meant to be." Reese stood in front of me, his hazel eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. He reached up to wipe away my tears with surprising gentleness. "No more running. No more questioning your worth. You're exactly who we need, who they need." He gestured to the pups who were making happy sounds as they were passed around to pack members eager to see the returned heirs. "Trust us to show you what you couldn't see yourself. looking out at the bowing crowd, at the 3 powerful alphas who'd claimed me as theirs, at the 20 tiny lives I'd saved now being celebrated by an entire pack, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. For weeks I'd been surviving on determination and fear, convinced I was just postponing the inevitable moment when everything would fall apart. But maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe this wasn't an ending at all. Maybe it was finally the beginning. I'd been waiting for my whole life. A family, a purpose, a place where being myself was not just enough, it was everything. The word Barren didn't define me anymore. I wasn't empty or broken or useless. I was whole, complete, exactly as I was meant to be. And as the pack's cheers rose around us and the 3 kings held me close, I finally let myself believe it.